Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here, a Venusian goddess of harmony, justice and equipoise, here to talk to you today about Sun in Libra and to wish you a happy autumn equinox. As I have a 7th house Sun myself, I often feel that I would be happiest if I got to be a goddess of everlasting autumn. This is my favourite season, this period between September and October, where I feel that everything is held in a perfect state of balance. Gone are the long, hot, torrid, humid, unbearable, oppressive days of the summer where the days never seem to end and we feel robbed of the purity and the dreamy graciousness of night. Instead, we can have the balance of those clear, pellucid days, of witnessing the crisp, gingery orange colours of the leaves as they suck in their chlorophyll and give this one last burst of glorious colour before they sacrifice themselves unto the necessity of the winter, where we are again blessed with beautiful astronomical darkness, where we can go outside at 8 or 9 in the evening and witness the perfect scintillating brilliance of the constellated stars from which I attempt to derive so much wisdom. We get to enjoy both the beauties of the day and of the night, to experience the equilibrium between these two different realms of the conscious and the unconscious, between the diurnal and nocturnal, as a perfect synthesis of our lived experience. So it's almost like when someone with Sun in Libra or in the 7th house is incarnated within this 30-day period every year, it's almost like they look out onto this perfect, balanced, dreamy, reflective, beautiful, graceful autumnal period and say to themselves, this is the ideal world. This is life as it should be, ideologically, intellectually, and aesthetically. How can I cultivate that perfect world of balance and equipoise, both within myself and in my relationships and connections with things out there in the outer world? How can I find the sacred middle ground and golden mean between them? Because Libra likes gold. And if you can maintain access to that gold, all the better. Then life can be pleasant and luscious at all times. There are berries on the boughs, there is fruits on the trees, and the trees are even putting out catkins in preparation for their fecundation next year. So there's a sense in which everything is settled and as it should be. And the great question then posed to the person with Sun in Libra is, how do I introduce this state of equilibrium and homeostasis into the rest of my life? It is the 7th sign of the zodiac, so there is that sense of already having gone on this long experiential journey since things kicked off impetuously and naively and ferociously back at the spring equinox when the Sun entered into Aries. And we've experienced all of these different approaches and sides of life along the way, all of the ups and downs, all of the extremities of different elements waging wars between themselves. And it's almost like then that Libra becomes this grand alchemist of saying, okay, well, I've seen all of these ups and downs, and I can see that there is a value, there is a wisdom, there is a philosophical, practical and ideological brilliance to all of these different energies that I've experienced along the way. I've learnt things from Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, and Leo and Virgo. How can I take all of those and somehow combine them into some perfectly sustainable gracious and ethical approach to life without any one of them predominating. Because in having those experiences, and having those experiences of being a Leo or a Taurus or an Aries and along the way, we've seen the good things they've been able to bring into our lives, but we've also seen the different troubles and difficulties and problems with which they are associated. So it's kind of trying to then want to cultivate this idealized system in which we can have the best of all of these worlds whilst minimizing their more dangerous extremities. And part of this is by not allowing anything to go too far, to be moderate and balanced and careful and considerate and calibrated in everything that you do. I think when we've reached this autumn period in our solar journey, Sun in Libra has realized that life can bring you great, dizzying, euphoric highs and bursts of intoxicating celestial pleasure, but it can also take you deep down into the very darkest, most terrifying, painful pits of experience and deprivation, suffering and loneliness. And it kind of realizes that if you get stuck on this roller coaster of extremes, it's very easy to just keep pivoting between these dualities and never feeling settled, never feeling centered, never feeling rooted in anything and being ruled by Venus. Venus likes to have a sense that whatever brings her pleasure, whatever brings her joy, whatever brings her satisfaction and a sense of personal fertility and feminine power, she wants to hold on to. She doesn't want to have bliss and joy and pleasure one day and then to live in poverty and difficulty in the next. Other signs might quite enjoy those dramatic ups and downs, but for Libra, those things are terribly stressful and anxiety-inducing. She wants to keep those kinds of big upheavals at bay. So it's that question then of saying, okay, well, I realize I can't have those dizzying euphoric highs without simultaneously also having those tragic lows. And she thinks for a bit, and she has this philosophical revelation where she realizes there is a basic order and system of law behind the universe. And people have recognized the fact that this law of divine equipoise and grace and equilibrium has existed throughout the generations, and we have given many different names to it. The one we are probably most aware of today is karma. Buddhists might have called it dharma. To the ancient Egyptians, it was mat, and then to the ancient Greeks, it was justice. But behind it all, they've realized that actions do not exist in a vacuum or an insular state, that anything we do has an equal and opposite reaction, as is posited in Newton's law. So there is that Newtonian basis to the world, not just in terms of energy dynamics, but interpersonal energy dynamics as well. And this is where there's been a huge progress from the philosophy of Aries to the philosophy of Libra. Aries just does what it wants. It just chases its raw, initial, undifferentiated impulses. But with the Sun in Libra, it realizes that actually those impulses, those desires, those wants have consequences. And rather than just allowing itself to be caught up by the dizzying passions and fires that are so necessary to keep us driven during the return of solar energy at the spring equinox, with the sunlight diminishing now, Sun in Libra realizes that that kind of constant, urgent momentum is not only no longer necessary, but also kind of dangerous if you carry it on into the incoming winter, where we naturally become more introspective, more reflective, more turned towards ourselves and the small relationships and communities that we seek refuge among in those cold months. So she's realized there is a consequence to our actions, that we can do something, we can say something, sometimes we can even just think and believe something, and it evokes a reaction from the world. It's like a seesaw. If you press down one side, the other side goes up. And for the people who live cycling in that bipolar passion between euphoria and dysphoria, life is always just going up and down like the seesaw. However, if you find a way to be more conscientious, to be more gracious, to be more considerate, to look more deeply at the things that you say, do, think, and believe before you become thoroughly engaged and committed to them, you are more likely to make considered decisions that might not be causing these big swings and elevations, but which might just be gently adjusting and tipping the scales back and forth. You know, it's like if you went out and you had a big, mad, drunken Dionysian night. You get hugely drunk, maybe you take lots of drugs, you have, at the time, you have what just feels like a perfect dream of a night. You lose all self-consciousness, you lose all sense of being divided from your fellow man, and you just have this great orgiastic, orgasmic time. You know you're going to have to pay for it the next day. That is the rule of Libra. You come home and then you can't fucking move for a week because you're so disastrously hungover after the extremes of what you've put your body through. So Libra realizes that nothing in this life comes free. Everything exacts its price, exacts its tax. And you shouldn't commit to any of these actions or different things unless you're willing to pay the price. You've got to make sure you energetically and spiritually have in the bank whatever you are seeking. And in order to engage in life in this ideological fashion, to not act or react immediately, but to have the ability to consider the long-range consequences of anything you say, do, think, or feel, you need to have some degree of clarity and detachment. And this is why Libra is an air sign. Often when different versions of justice was personified, she was depicted as a winged being. In ancient Egypt, this goddess of cosmic harmony and balance was known as Mat. That's M-A apostrophe A-T. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. I'm sure I am not pronouncing it like an authentic ancient Egyptian. I don't think there are any authentic ancient Egyptians watching this channel. If they are watching it from the realm of the Akashic records, and they're probably not able to leave disparaging comments on my YouTube videos. And for that, I am very grateful, as that kind of criticism would keep me awake deeply into the night. Anyway, Mat was depicted with having these beautiful long wings and a feather sticking out of her head. I believe she was inspired by the shape of the constellation of Virgo. If you look at a lot of the imagery of the gods in ancient Egyptian manuscripts and papyri and on the walls of the temples and the pyramids, I noticed that a lot of the gods have very rigid postures that they adhere to, and that many of those postures actually follow the outlines of given constellations. So I think that Mat actually has a similar shape to the constellation of Virgo, down to the feather, because if you look where the head is meant to be on the constellation of Virgo, there doesn't really seem to be one there. Instead, there is this kind of long string of stars, which I think the ancient Egyptians chose to depict with the feather. But Mat, she played a very important part in the ancient Egyptian afterlife. It was believed after the soul of the dead had travelled through all of the difficult journeys and travails of the land of the dead, there would be this terrifying weighing ceremony where all of their deeds, both good and bad, would be weighed against this feather of Mat, this feather of justice and judgment of Mat. And if it was balanced with the feather, then they would be permitted to go forth into a beautiful heavenly celestial afterlife. However, if they were found wanting, if the scales were imbalanced one way or the other, then their heart would be ripped out and would be fed to a horrible crocodilian monster demon. So this idea of justice of Libra extends to the idea that our actions have consequences beyond ourselves. They may even have consequences beyond our lifetimes. And if you're thinking that far ahead, the general idea is that you're going to place much more seriousness and much more consideration and much more deliberation on anything you do, because you want to be able to look back on any of those actions you've committed to and see the long-term consequences and ask yourself, was that worth it? Is this, I might desperately want to do this now, but what are the consequences of that? And could I live with those consequences even unto my very death, even unto the next world itself? So the sun in Libra can no longer just youthfully and madly throw itself into things with joyous, innocent abandon like sun in Aries did, because it has lost that primal innocence. It has aged too much in its journeys. From then, since the spring equinox, it has developed too much awareness of life and what happens in the different impulsive actions we do. You know, if we're just living in that Aries mode, we can throw ourselves into things with wild abandon. We can do things at the drop of the hat because our desires and passions and wants and angers and lust pull us in this way or that. But then later on, as we develop more conscientiousness, more of an understanding that we do not live as an egoistic, isolated entity, but we live as part of a larger social community where other people are walking around having lives just as vivid, complex, and emotionally turbulent and deep as ourselves, we then place more respect on the potential for our actions to both harm and potentially help those around us. So there then develops this moral weight and significance in Libra. It's not just enough that Sun in Libra can just live by itself and for itself, because it's too socially aware of living as part of a greater relationship with the human race. And it gives it this sense that while it wants to live a life that is bringing pleasure and joy and harmony and balance to itself, it kind of realizes it can only achieve that if it's also acting in an ethical, upstanding, righteous way with other people, that it has that balance between being accountable to itself and being accountable to other people. But it wants to do this in the right way. It wants to still find balance between these things. It doesn't want to take the Neptunian or Piscean logic of sacrificing itself utterly and completely and totally for the benefit of others. It kind of is more saying, I want to have my portion, but I don't want my portion to be at the expense of someone else's hunger and suffering. I want to have my portion, and I want to make sure other people have their portion too. You know, it's that Solomonic narrative from the Old Testament, the idea of him, when there's this couple arguing over a son, he says, all right, well, if you both want this child, cut it down the middle. You know, that is the Libran logic, that everyone gets their fair share and portion. And yet, while on a purely mathematical level, the idea of maintaining that balance and equipoise between self and other is beautiful and perfect and lovely to represent in art and poetry and music. It's much harder to pull off in the real physical world, where such ideals are not easy to attain in a life that is more inclined to extremity than balance. So this is kind of the big existential conundrum of Libra, is just that because it may idealize this idea of social and cosmic harmony and justice for all, and sometimes see itself as the person who has been vested with the cosmic responsibility of maintaining this law both for itself and other people, it's always being confronted and stymied by the practical reality of how things actually often are. And this is why you can meet plenty of Librans who might truly believe in these wonderful ideologies and have these very high social and political standards over how things can be, and yet also be the same people who are terrible at holding that in their personal life. You know, you can get plenty of Aryans who, apparently being the most selfish sign, can do things that are wonderfully compassionate and selfless and generous and giving. And you can also meet many Librans who will happily preach at everyone about this or that political injustice, and then go about performing almost exactly the same crimes and problems in their own personal life that they're complaining seeing happening, taking out on a larger global scale in the socio-political arena. So just because we aspire to and idealize something, that doesn't mean we are always able to be the living exponents of those ideologies. You know, air is concerned with rationality and the mind and social interactions. It's often short on the practical details that a Virgo or a Capricorn or a Taurus might honor, of saying, sure, Libra, those ideals and philosophies you have and ethics, they're all wonderful, but we've crunched the numbers, we've done the data, we've done the physical studies and practical tests, and guess what? They're not fucking workable. So this is why I often feel like Libra really is one of the true perfectionists of the zodiac. We often ascribe Virgo as being a perfectionist. And yes, Virgo does care about perfection. Again, Virgo is the 6th sign of the zodiac. So we've, again, had that long journey from, you know, our original innocent, buffoonish innocence of when we are in Aries, and all the way we've developed along the way. So when you reach Virgo and you're halfway through the zodiac, you kind of think that whatever skills or talents or mental and physical abilities you developed on the way, you should have them to a pretty high standard by now. Either that, or you've just been sitting around in your ass and wasting your time. You know, Virgo cares about developing and refining the skill of its mind, of its body, and of its practical, psychological, intellectual, and cognitive abilities, but all with the idea of fulfilling some kind of practical, useful, real-world function that can be externalized in the world. And even though it has those very high perfectionist standards, it's still an earth sign. It still understands that in order to bring anything into being or to do anything in this world, you have to run the risk of making mistakes, of failures. And you might cringe and groan and lose sleep over that and develop gastric ulcers over that, but you still go ahead and do it because you feel that earthly drive to perfect. Whereas I feel like sometimes with Libra, they sometimes feel that if they just found the right system, if they just found the right mental order or philosophy of how things should be, and then preached about that and spoke about that very loudly to everyone, or maybe even, dare I say it, lived it themselves, somehow everything would just fall into place, and everyone around them would see the reason, the rationality, and the logic behind this mathematical symmetry that they've worked out, and end up being quite appalled and shocked when a lot of the people around them either tell them that their ideas are impracticable, or just tell them that they are full of shit, or are not interested in investing in this realm of balance that Libra is looking towards. You know, many people have criticized depictions of heaven and depictions of utopia in literature, because there is a feeling that in some way when we see these perfect heavens where everything is just balanced and serene and harmonious and everyone's very agreeable and gets along, and conflict and sin and crime and drama and erroneous human passions have all been extirpated and excised, a lot of people read that and feel like, well, a lot of the fun and joy of existence have gone as well. So, you know, maybe a Libra might read that and think that sounds great, but a lot of other people, a lot of other humans are in love with their lower bestial infections. They love, you know, their crazy fiery passions and their earthy animal instincts. And when they read these perfect idealized worlds that Libran people are demanding be brought into being, they might want to appreciate it on some airy aesthetic level, but other parts of them kind of feel like, yeah, if we had this perfect world where everything was balanced and fair and equal, things might be pretty boring. It would mean chopping off a lot of what it means to be human. But then where the sun is placed always shows our bias of the part of the human experience that we identify with the most. And the sun in Libra being in the air, you know, air signs are like the birds. They fly around in this higher sphere, which means they have a natural tendency to look down on the earth, to see earthly, human, animal qualities within us as being bestial and lowly, while the earth sign lounging around under a tree enjoying, you know, a hearty ploughman's lunch might be saying, well, I don't know why you're fucking looking down on me up there, you nasty old Libran buzzard. The meadow looks pretty beautiful for where I'm sitting as well. I can actually touch and feel things up here, whereas where you're up there in the sky, flying around by yourself, nothing touches you and you feel nothing. And this is one of the odd qualities, I think, about Venus being the ruler of an air sign, that we associate Venus normally with sensuality and touch and feelings and closeness to other people. And I feel like Libra simultaneously idealizes the idea of closeness and romance and intimacy and softness and graciousness and kindness and compassion with other people, and yet, like all air signs, struggles with the living reality of what it actually means to be close to another person. You know, if you truly want to believe yourself to be this just, impassive, reasoning being who always looks at things with a clear mind and never allows their bodily functions or, you know, their foggy emotions to get in the way, you're going to try and keep yourself detached from those more personal human feelings and valuation systems. And so actually when Librans are in situations where deep emotions and deep feelings and deep attachments are aroused, it kind of freaks them out because it's a very different realm from the ideological one they're looking at. You know, the romance that they've written out and plotted out mathematically on paper is very different from how it might be experienced as a living reality, where they have to experience some of the tension and the claustrophobia of being close to someone, that actually, when we get close to someone and we experience those physical sensations and those passions and those deep emotions, we start to lose that precious clarity. We start to lose that precious equanimity and dispassion. It's very hard for us just to feel like we are seeing everyone fairly and equally and giving everyone their due if we've suddenly become overly attached to one person. So again, it's this desire to have intimacy with another person, but also to somehow find a way of not losing yourself to that as well. And this can account for some of the vacillating back and forth and indecisive nature of Libra, because really it kind of wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to do the thing that's going to satisfy it and give it what it wants, but it also wants the other person to have that as well. And a lot of the time this isn't possible. And rather than just admit this and go with the best compromise possible, the Libra person can be inclined just to sit on the fence indefinitely, just hoping that all the time that they're constantly arguing and battling it out in the parliament of their mind, that somehow everything will work out of its own accord. It's that Venusian tendency just to say, okay, things are getting a bit too tense and dramatic and difficult here. I'm just going to sit back and laze around over here and just hope that everyone else works it out amongst themselves, because, you know, I'm debating back and forth and it's just not fucking getting me anywhere. I cannot make a decision to save my life. But this is also why a lot of the Sun in Libra and also people with Sun in Venus, Sun in the 7th, often, I've noticed, have a strong attraction to fiery people, because when they meet a fiery person who just sees things very clearly and just says, yes, I want to do this, or yes, we should do this, or this is the thing you should do, it cuts through the endless equivocating and debating that's going on inside. And it's like, oh, thank you, you have saved me from the excesses of my own brain, which will happily worry about this problem for the end of time. So they kind of get the perfect middle ground there, because when they meet a fiery person who has no problem doing something that is solely for their own selves and their own pleasure without needing to particularly justify it to anyone, then yes, that they bypass that middleman, but also they satisfy that desire for the sun in Libra to feel like it can't just live for itself, it needs someone else to live for as well. And with some sun in Libra or some sun in 7th house people, this can mean almost a compulsive existential drive to have close relationships, including close friendships. There is a feeling that life isn't necessarily worth living unless you have those things, that is your very raison d'etre, that is the reason you were brought into this world, to figure out and understand the dynamics between humans and to find ways of perfecting and refining them. You know, it's a step away from Virgo that feels like it can somehow be an island unto itself, that it can be sufficient unto itself. Once we've reached Libra, it's almost like, no, I can't stand to do everything by myself anymore. I can't stand to work 23 hours a day because I'm insisting proudly on doing everything for myself. If I work with someone else, if I share my labor with someone else, if I share my pleasure with someone else, then the ability that I have to maximize both my productivity and pleasure in life has been doubled by the fact that I am no longer doing it alone. And yet there also comes the recognition that with committing to that system of relationship, there's certain parts of yourself you have to lose. You know, to me, one of the reasons Sun in Virgo is so obsessed often with protecting its solitude and its personal integrity is because, like a virgin knows that it has to lose something apparently purified and special in sacrificing its body and sexuality to another person, but really what it is losing there is losing its total freedom, its total purity to serve itself, to be only itself and to be answerable to no one. But once you accept someone else into your life and you say to that person, your needs, values, wants and desires are just as important to me as my own wants, desires and needs are, you have to then see that other person as being a living, real extension of yourself. And this is different from how Taurus does it. You know, Taurus mostly sees other people as its personal possessions and objects and playthings. With the Libra person, it's trying to see that other person as a real reality, as someone who is its equal. It has to fight against some of its own natural arrogance and pride here and say, no, what you want and need is just as important as me. Neither of us is higher or lower than the other. We might need to adjust those scales sometimes, where one person initiates and the other receives, one person takes and the other gives. But, you know, like a good accountant, we need to make sure that we are maintaining a mutuality, that we are maintaining the level in which we are giving, receiving to one another at all times, that neither one of us is becoming too preponderant. And I think the Virgo sun is afraid of all that it might have to lose and sacrifice and compromise, and the ideals and practical time it has to give to these things, whereas Libra in theory anyway, and the sun in the 7th anyway, is predisposed to want that. And this ties us back to some of the ancient astrological symbolism of the constellation of Libra. We tend to see the constellation of Libra now as scales, as man-made objects, representing the very human-centered, anthropocentric human logic of the justice and social ideology that Libra conveys. But one of the older depictions of the scales was not as scales, but as a yoke. You know, a yoke was something that you put around the neck or halter of an animal to yoke it, to attach it to a plough so that it could work for you. You know, this idea of an animal and a man-made machine being harnessed together to do more work. And it's kind of the same in relationships. It's saying if you want to reap some of the pleasurable fruit of the relationship you're in, there's also a little part of yourself that you have to permit to be yoked and enslaved to the work and productivity of that relationship. So you can see that there are a lot of contradictions and dualities in this sign, hence the doubleness of the scales. You know, it is very easy when you are trying to satisfy both self and other, both your ego and society at large, to feel that you are serving two masters, that there are two things that are being asked of you that are very difficult to find the synthesis between. You know, if you just took the egocentric view of Aries, life would probably be easier on some level. If you just took the completely self-sacrificing view of, say, Pisces or occasionally Aquarius, again, it might be easy. You might not be happy. You might not be balanced because you are taking those extreme approaches, but they would be simpler because you would have chosen to commit to one scale over the other. But that need to constantly marry those two different states of awareness can produce a lot of anxiety. And to me, it's one of the ironies of Libra, is that sometimes they can be as serene and as Venusian and as apparently calm and dispassionate as Libra would like to appear to the world, and sometimes they are some of the most anxious, erratic, nervous wrecks of a people I've ever met, who cannot settle for a single moment because they're always so excessively worried about the constructs and perception of almost anything that they do that it almost paralyzes them. You know, it's a big responsibility to place these big ideologies and concepts upon yourself and to see yourself as the living reification of them, the personal upholder of mat, of karma, of justice, to always be thinking of your life in that long-range way, to always be stuck in that very tactical headspace of cognition. You know, I think all Librans would benefit from actually indulging the more earthy Venusian side of their nature. I think if they found a way to relax more, to turn off their head more, to not believe that, you know, rationality and the careful mapping out of things is the only way to work things out, but that sometimes we can just let things be settled for themselves, or we can trust our gut instincts and intuition. If they learn to balance those with their naturally extended judicial powers, then they could truly achieve that Venusian balance. I mean, like I said, I've got the sun in the 7th house as well, and I also found it a long journey of balancing those high philosophies and sense of social responsibility with my need to become myself. I feel like I'm in quite a good place for it now, of you know, finding that balance between work and leisure, between self and other, but the temptation at any given moment to suddenly lurch precariously into one scale or another is a constant thing. You know, scales are shaky, they're wobbly, they're very sensitive. You know, the slightest thing can set them ajar. And I've met many very Libran people who can also be set into a flurry very quickly. So learning to actually truly be centered in themselves, to find their own personal center, their own personal point of experiential rather than conceptual balance, I think is a very important thing for a Libran person to be able to do. Anyway, I've already spoken quite lengthily on this sign, because not only is my sun in the 7th house, which has Libran qualities, my progressed sun has also been in Libra for about the last 7 or 8 years. And it's interesting how quickly that progression actually played out in my life. That prior to that point, when my sun had just been progressing more through the sign of Virgo, I was a much more self-contained and insular person. I was quite happy to spend very, very long periods by myself, even if I still felt some of those seventh house inclinations. I often fantasized about living alone in the mountains or in the woods and committing to this kind of hermetic lifestyle. And then almost suddenly overnight, when my sun progressed into Libra, and I wasn't aware of this at the time because my knowledge of astrology wasn't that developed at that point, almost overnight, I suddenly found this state of extreme solitude and loneliness unbearable. I felt like I needed people, I needed relationships, I needed to be actively involved in society and contributing and receiving something back and to be where the human action was. I suddenly found that I actually really cared and needed friendships and needed interactions, things I kind of scoffed and snubbed and turned my nose up before in a kind of surly Virgoan way. So there is a lot of dynamic energy to this sign. It is a cardinal sign and therefore is able to give a huge amount of energy to the things that interest it, to social interactions, to matters of social justice, to politics, to art and culture, which many different forms of art were attempting to find some kind of idealized classical balance. Classical art, classical architecture, classical music were all based on this idea of finding the perfect mathematical ratio for producing art that was perfect, where things weren't excessive and extreme like they later were in the Romantic movement, but where everything fitted together to produce something that was neither too much nor too little, but was exactly what it needed to be. And figuring out exactly what it needs to be at any given damn moment in its entire life, from second to second, is the ongoing anxiety and struggle of every person with Sun in Libra or the 7th house. And with that, I will put the yoke and halter around my neck and go back to ploughing those sweet fruits of love.